Oh, hey, good. Oh, wait, are we here? Yes, we're live. Good morning. Sorry, we were talking about comic books. Welcome this morning to a special interview. We are very happy to have Andre Fili here of UFC, talking to us about his career, himself, and comic books, which he is a big fan of. I see you consistently on the new weeks looking for stuff.
Every week, once a week, I'm in here.
And well, we're going to get to the comic books. I've talked to him ad nauseum about comic books. I know you guys haven't, so we're going to get to that. But I want to find out a little bit more about you because I have talked to you about your career, just a little bit about what got you going. But when you're in, there's things going on. I don't have time to sit down with you. This is fantastic. Can you tell us what you do and maybe what brought you to this?
Yeah, I'm a professional fighter. I fight in the UFC, which is the premier league, I guess. Fighting is weird. It's different than most sports. So I would compare, for people who have no idea about professional fighting, UFC is the equivalent of the NFL or the MLB or the NBA for MMA. So I compete in the UFC, and I've been doing that basically my whole life. I've been fortunate enough I haven't had a real job since like I was 21 years old. I just went all in on.
What was your real job then?
Target. I worked at Target.
Nice.
Yeah. As far as real jobs go, like, I don't know how real that is, but I worked at Target. I worked in electronics, so I just sold video games to kids. It was like pretty easy, and even then, I wasn't really like an exemplary employee. Like I was completely focused on fighting, whether it was like high school or the little jobs I worked before. I completely focused on fighting. I was always obsessed with fighting. So I wasn't really, nothing else really got my attention except fighting. So, I poured so much of myself into it that at some point I turned pro at 19, but I was still kind of I turned pro at 19, I was still kind of working to pay the bills. And then by 21, I just said forget everything else and went all in on fighting. I stopped going to school. I stopped, I was pretending to go. I was pretending to go to community college. I stopped pretending. I was kind of even pretending to have a job. I worked, but I was like, all I cared about was fighting. So I just stopped pretending and I went pro at 21. Like went pro at 19, quit everything else at 21, and I was in the UFC at 23. So it's really been my career my entire life. It's really just been all I've done. People ask what I did before fighting, and there was never a time. Yeah, I can't even remember. Like I've been obsessed with fighting since 13 or 14. I've been doing it professionally since 19, and the rest is history. So, as far as what got me to this place, I just always loved fighting. I grew up doing a lot of fights. Grew up, a little rough and getting in fights and getting into trouble. And once I saw the UFC, it was like I remember when I was 13 or 14 on my little Sony TV in my bedroom. It was like smaller than this laptop, and I watched the UFC for the first time. It was like instantly like, oh shit, this is what I'm gonna do for the rest of my life. Like I just knew, I knew at 13 or 14 years old I was gonna be a professional fighter, and everything since then has just been.
So did you, when you knew this, did you find, how did you find somebody to train you and to get you going on this? And exactly what kind of fighting do you do in that?
I do. So MMA is mixed martial arts. Is a mixture of really any martial art. There's only like 6 or 7 rules. No eye gouging, no biting, no hair pulling, no groin strikes. Other than that, you can basically do whatever you want. Right.
Okay.
You're just fighting. So I mostly do jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai, boxing, and wrestling. Those are probably the 4 pillars of my game. But I learned judo from guys. I've learned taekwondo and karate techniques. There's it's all encompassing, right? So it's mixed martial arts. So you have to have a complete, well-rounded fight game. But I try to incorporate a little bit of everything into the fight game.
But do most people do that, or that incorporating all of that stuff sounds extremely difficult.
Yeah,
as opposed to one practice.
It is, but the sport has evolved so much. So when people think of old UFC, it was like basically a tough man contest. He's like, okay, we'll take a karate black belt and we'll have him fight a sumo wrestler, something, some just nonsense, just a bunch of these things that like, it was late '80s, early '90s, and people didn't really understand fighting really. They saw kung fu movies and thought that that's what like fighting really looked like. And it just isn't, it's not the reality situation. So the UFC kind of started as a way for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners to come to everybody and compete anybody because it wasn't really well known. But it's evolved into this thing where basically my generation and younger now, you have to be well rounded. Like the sport has evolved so quickly, so it's a typical sport in the world. It's evolved from this sort of sideshow circus thing where you have a karate black belt and a college wrestler and they're just fighting with no technique. It's evolved into a real professional sport where you have kids training from a really young age. And you have to be well rounded and you have to be able to blend everything together. You have kids who this is all they've ever done. And I think my generation was the first generation of kids to start mixing everything together seamlessly because we really wanted to fight.
Okay.
Whereas like the generation before me was maybe a boxer who had discovered kickboxing and started mixing that in, and then maybe found MMA and tried to put it all together, or a college wrestler who after wrestling didn't have any challenge and saw MMA and was like, oh, this will be a way to continue competing, right? Yeah. So you have guys who only did one thing into their mid-20s and then discovered MMA and transitioned. Whereas like my generation, I started doing everything together by 14. Some of these kids are 7 or 8 years old and they're already mixing it. So you see the progress in sport, and it's pretty awesome.
That's pretty incredible, actually. And you did just have a match.
Yeah, I just fought. I just went to fight 2 Saturdays ago. So excited, and I'm not cut up or scraped up. I'm still all healed up. So I'm good.
Yeah. And your record in general is pretty darn.
Yeah, it is. I
mean, solid.
It's not bad. Yeah, I mean, it's good. I'm thankful for the opportunities I've had. I definitely ups and downs. Like there's always ups and downs, and I'm actually been going through quite a bit professionally the last 2 years. Some things that were my fault, some things that weren't. Like ups and downs as far as what you're making in pay and opportunities, and so things have course. I've been able to course correct the past 6 to 8 months. And it all kind of culminated a week and a half ago in a win. And it was nice to get paid, nice to get my hand raised in the cage, awesome. Nice to be back on track, and thankfully nothing, no injuries sustained, no cuts, broken bones. I actually broke his arm in the fight, so you can't play.
That's par for the course.
Yeah, you can't play fighting like know what I mean. Like you can play other sports, but fighting is not a game. The stakes can be pretty high. So I'm thankful for successfully fought.
And do you have anything coming up?
I'm hoping to fight in December, but it's not scheduled yet. So usually you know about 2 months out. So we stay in shape all the time, and then you usually, if things go right, you get like an 8-week notice, or 9-week notice. You can do an 8-week camp, which is about what you want to do your body to fight.
Do you know who you're going to be fighting at that time?
Usually,
so you
can switch.
Okay, they do. Yeah. So you can, if you kind of prepare.
Yeah, in a perfect world, they say you're fighting on this day. You're fighting this guy on this day in this city, and then you can prepare for that. Okay. Specific things to beat that guy. You can start working with partners who have the same body type as them, so you used to seeing that look. But it's super common for opponents to change, or things to be. Fighting, as much as it is a legitimate sport, and it's on ESPN, it's on SportsCenter next to football and basketball, it's still a sport. Like and it'll always be that way. It's still about half WWE. So things are changing on the fly, and crazy stuff will happen and change the whole landscape of fighting in a matter of days. And when I say it's WWE, I mean it's a circus, but it's not fake. Actually, like we're just actual maniacs that like crazy things happen, and it can be good. So, like this last fight, halfway through the 1 month mark, my opponent got injured, and so I got a new opponent. The guy I fought was actually the second opponent. No, but I've taken fights on 2 weeks' notice. I've had friends take fight. I had a friend to get in the UFC take a fight on like 7 days' notice in Germany, like against the guy who's bigger than him. Like you just have to. I mean, fighting is chaos. That's like it really is. Fighting is chaos. You adapt, improvise, and adjust, and overcome on the fly. You know?
Okay. Well, I mean, you got till December. So
yeah. Means, no, I'm in a good spot. Yeah. I have 2 months of I'm chilling. Yeah, my fight's not even booked, but it does get crazy.
And well, if you've got till December, that means you've got plenty of time to catch up on comics.
Exactly. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because as we've said, he a big comic fan. Comes in weekly to look for the books. You are more of a trade man.
Definitely more of a trade guy.
Yeah. And what was it that sparked your love for comics?
I got back into comics probably. I guess I should say got back in because I've loved comics my whole life. I got back into really reading comics religiously probably 5 or 6 years ago. Maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I'm like, oh, yeah, I'm thinking about like 5 or 6 years ago was no.
Sometimes I look back and I still think it's like 1990.
It's insane. Someone would be like people say like, oh, 30 years ago. I'm like, oh, it's 1970 something. No, 30 years ago was 1990.
Yeah, yes.
Scary. It's a scary thing.
The older you get, the more warp time gets.
It's insane. Yeah. So I started. Maybe 6 or 7 years ago, I started really getting into comic books, like really enthusiastically again. But I've always loved comics. I grew up on comics. I grew up watching, the '90s X-Men, Spider-Man, Batman animated series. That's all I watched. And when I was a kid, I loved those shows because I only cared about fighting, even as a little kid. Like I remember, I wouldn't watch cartoons if there was no fighting. Okay. Arthur and Captain Planet was just not interested. Like, I want to watch X-Men and Batman and Spider-Man because there's a bunch of fighting. That's what I cared about. Like you got to go get the bad guys. That's like all I cared about. And my parents are pretty young, so my dad would bring home in the '90s. My dad would bring home Spider-Man. They're all single issues. There's never like. They're all just like random issues, and there's never an overarching story. But I remember growing up on these comic books and how much they meant to me, how much they meant to me. I can't remember a time that they didn't. And so, as I got older, I started transitioning to trade. I love this having. I'm super, as you know, I'm very obsessive compulsive, very much a completionist. I like having the whole story arc. So I'd rather wait 6 months and get it all want and be able to binge read it and put it on my shelf and have it complete instead of only issue to issue. So,
and then it's tucked away in a closet somewhere. You can't. Sure. Yeah, it looks so beautiful on the thing.
The biggest thing I realize is like when I shop for issues, if I go issues, then what happens is one of two things happen. If I go monthly issue, it feels good then. Like it feels good to come and get a new issue, but I have this instant gratification. I don't have to wait 6 months. It's a fun thing to have a full list, whatever. But one of two things is going to happen. Either I get 4 to 5, 6 comics in, and I don't really like it, and then I have 6 random issues of a comic book that I couldn't give a shit about, or I love it, and I have to wait, and then I'm just going to end up buying the trade from my shelf anyway. So now I have
no point in having both.
Now I have the issues and the trade, and it's just like so. I really had to like check myself and go, okay, like pump the brakes. Just be patient, and so I have a room full of trades, which is funny because I have bought my house 2 years ago, and basically the deal I made with my girlfriend was like the guest room is her walk-in closet, basically.
Okay, perfect.
But the office is it's literally nothing but comics and video games.
That's awesome.
It's just comic books. It's just every video game console I've had from my original PS. But the first video game console that was ever mine was my PS1 in 1996. I still have the original one.
And it works?
And it works, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, great condition. I have a little shelf of all my game consoles, and then I have 3 bookcases for comic books. And people will come they'll come visit, and I'll give them a tour, and they'll look at my house, and they'll walk in my comic book room, and they'll go, "Oh wow, like this is a lot of comic books, Like, how much is all this worth?" Like, It's worth absolutely. How much am I paid? Or how much is it worth? Because trades aren't worth shit. Like no one cares.
Yeah, they're just well, some of them, but most of them no.
Typically, like I look at this and I look at my shelves and I'm just like, makes me so happy to be in my little nerd cave. Then I'm just like, this is the exact type of stuff that when you die, your grandkids just go like, what are we doing with this shit? Like I don't.
That's right. It's there for you.
Yeah,
this is your little paradise in there. And you were talking about getting the single issues and then feeling compelled to buy the trades.
Yeah.
We were just talking before we started the video. He has the other problem too. When he's got the collection of trades and then something like 7 to Eternity comes out with this beautiful hardcover, he's going to feel compelled to buy that.
It's so comic books is, I think I don't know. I think like half of this comic book thing is like this addiction to my OCD. Like, cause I look at my shelf and everything's lined up like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the trades all have different colors. And just something about it is so aesthetically pleasing and that completionist in me. So when I see those hardcovers, I'm like, or even the complete editions, like the like Vertigo and Vertigo started doing the like they're just like 3 trades together. So instead of 15 books, you only have the 5 or whatever, you know, like or instead of 10, you only have 4. It just they look so much better than big complete editions. I'm like, do I have to rebuy this entire library? Like, I really hope I don't, but even looking at them now, I'm like,
you're just staring at me right. Yeah,
like those big Fables trades. It's perfect.
Sorry about that.
Technical difficulties.
Technical difficulties. I always have the hardcovers in one spot. Yeah. I've got but at the same time, I want to keep the same creators together.
Yeah. So I try to keep it as simple as possible and just go alphabetical, because if I realize if I do too much, like if I start categorizing by like genre, which I've thought about, or by creator, or by hardback, I'll get so obsessive. So I just go alphabetical order, and I do have some dips in my
You've alphabetized your trade wall
entire.
That's crazy.
Yeah, my entire.
Everything. I actually hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah, I just alphabetized everything, and it was a process. But yeah, so it's chaos in one way where there's like Batman next to like some Jeff Lemire.
That's what I'm talking about.
It's like Batman, and like a random Jeff Lemire, like creator owned thing, and then like a hardback, and then like this, and it's just like, but it's all complete. It's all organized by alphabet. And then you have these big chunks of like all the criminals lined up, all the 100 bullets lined up, all the deadly class, all the saga lined up, and it just looks, you know what I mean? It just looks
just absolutely beautiful.
Kiss, yeah.
So then let's talk. You mentioned some of the people that you really like. Who are some of your favorites? Because you are very much more of an indie guy, than you are DC and Marvel. But you have ventured into some DC and Marvel, and I believe that your hero is Batman.
Batman's like, if I had to number one pick, it's hard to pick one, but Batman is the guy. Yeah.
Okay.
If it was like gun to your head, you can only read one superhero for the rest of your life. Batman. Like that's
okay.
Yeah.
Now, which is interesting because, as I said, he's not a big superhero guy.
Yeah.
So you're not as invested into the universe and the Justice League and the things like that,
right?
But just the
solo story,
the solo story, the stories of Batman.
Yeah. So I think in general, I'm just a story guy. Like I'm a narrative guy. Like I just love good stories, and if someone can tell me a new, fresh story with a familiar character, I'm in. So basically, when I go to buy comics at this point, when I started getting really back into comics heavily, like 6 or 7 years ago, I was so excited just to be reading comics. I was reading everything.
Okay.
And whether I even liked it or not, I'd finish. If I started a title, I'd finish it. Whether even if I wasn't enjoying it, I was just compulsively reading everything I get my hands on. And so, what's up, brother? So for me, I was just like compulsively reading whatever I could get my hands on. And then I had to start reeling myself in, because comics can be a part-time job if you let it. You know, you can really start consuming so much time and money. And when you're just grabbing everything on the shelf, it gets a little overwhelming. So when I started reeling it in, like the criteria I'm looking for is either characters that I love, and even more so now, creators that I love.
Okay.
Like if I see a guy that writes in a way that I love, I'll read a character that I don't give a shit about. Like I've never cared about Vision.
Okay.
Like it's never even been a thing I thought. Not that I think he's a bad character, but like Vision has never been a selling point for me. Right, but if Tom King's writing Vision, I'm gonna read it.
Then
You know
you're
what I'm
on.
saying?
Yes.
Like, Jeff Lemire's another guy. Whatever he's writing, I'm reading. He's so good. So the main thing I look for is either characters that I love or creators that I love. Like Lemire, I really enjoy Remember. What's his name? Remember?
I think it's Remember.
And then I like Remember stuff. Tom King. I know I'm forgetting a bunch of people, but Donnie Cates, Brew Baker. I'm a Brew Baker guy now. I wasn't a Brew Baker guy before, but I'm a big Brew Baker guy now. Donnie Cates can't really miss. Like I love Donnie Cates stuff. So whether it's indie stuff or stuff from the big two, I'm really more like looking at who's writing it, and if it's someone who's writing I enjoy, I'll read. Okay, I'll read basically whatever. The real reason I think I stray away from I enjoy indie comics more is because there's no like continuity to that. Just stories.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm here. I just want to read stories. I don't collect issues. I don't do really any special collector. I just want to read. I don't mind if the trades have no value. I just want good stories.
Yeah, you don't want to be bogged down by the fact that they reference something that happened, 30 issues ago.
Yeah,
you haven't even
exactly. And also too, not even so much like that. That's completely valid. But I think more is just. I think I get almost annoyed with this like idea of continuity because it's like they'll do some big event that like affects this and they have all these tie-ins. It just feels like masturbatory at some point. It's like here's an event, here's 30 tie-ins, here's a way that it affected it. And here's how none of it matters 6 months later. You know, it gets to this place where it's like, okay, if it seems to me that the mainstream comics, I read this and I look at what's going on and I understand there's 80 years worth of history. But to me, it's like, if you guys can't give a shit about the continuity, you can't ask me to, right? You know what I'm saying? Because it's evident that you guys don't give a shit about
it. They will rewrite stuff.
They will
restart the entire
universe whenever they see fit. They'll like they just do these things that like, you look at Golden Age stuff and it's like, thank God that happened, right? But you probably wouldn't sit down to read it. And
it can be rough. It can be really rough.
And none of it, and here's the thing: almost none of it resembles modern. Like even the characters are different. Like Jay Garrick hasn't been the Flash for however long, right? Like we talk about Flash, we're talking about Wally Wester, we're talking about Barry Allen, right? Mm-hmm. So thank God that someone wrote Jay Garrick as a Flash, but that's not really the Flash we're usually talking about. So Golden Age Comics is like cool. Thank God that happened, but I'm not going to sit down and read that. Silver Age stuff starts getting like interesting, but then it gets so wacky that like Superman's like shooting clones out of his fingers and
pushing the Earth out of its orbit and putting it right back.
Right, and it gets so like Silver. So the Golden Age doesn't really resemble what we're reading. Silver Age gets so wacky. Again, thank God that happened because we wouldn't be here without it. But it gets so wacky that you're probably going to sit and read that. Like Bronze Age and modern and all this stuff. The 90s were just like. We talked about like big guns and couches and spikes
over the top.
That like everything's extreme this and extreme that. That can get it's like, and then throughout all of that kind of wacky history, which as much as I enjoy it, like it's not. I'm going to go back and read throughout all that. All these things that were supposed to matter have been rewritten to not matter, and things that happened didn't actually happen or did re-happen, and you get to this place where you're like, okay, what if you guys all just shut up and just tell me a Batman story? What if we just forget all the 80 years? What if we just go, okay, whatever. There's 80 years of baggage. None of my business. Just
tell me a good story. Yes.
And like, so for example, like Batman's my favorite writer. Or I'm sorry, my favorite character from DC. So instead of going back and reading like all these giant events and classic stuff, and I think some of the classic stuff is cool to go back and read. Like I can jump on at Scott Snyder's run, and I can start at 1 and end at whatever 10 or 11, whatever it ends at, and have a complete Batman series that is fun, has a payoff, like is true to the character, but is kind of fresh. Like that's what I'm looking for, is like a good narrative that I cannot like take on 80 years worth of baggage.
And he did a good job of that. Like
I thought so too.
He in those 11 volumes, you just knew everything you needed to.
Yeah.
There was nothing outside of that. So who is your favorite writer?
Oh, man. Probably Brian K. Vaughan.
Really?
Yeah, I love the way he writes. I love the way.
So what's your favorite book?
Why the Last Man. And Why the Last Man might be my favorite book. As far as like the payoff, right? I read it after. It was a little bit before my time, so I read it in trades after, and it was one of those things that like you finish that last trade and you're like fighting back tears, and my girlfriend's like, "What's going on over there? Like, why?" And nothing. Like, I'm not fine. Leave me alone.
And yeah, it was satisfying. Yeah, you miss it, but you don't, because you were given such a wonderful.
Yeah, like it's perfect. Like it doesn't need to be rebooted. It doesn't need to be. And I'm a guy who constantly wants, like reboot this, or like what happens after. Like I always want more story. And that's a prime example of like holding the whole. And I think it's so important to. We've talked about this plenty of times. Like, I feel like sometimes writers, sometimes they start a story and it becomes clear they don't know where it's going, or it's the same problem with like a TV show that you love. Right? Like by season 5, you're like, what the hell are you doing with these characters? Like, why? You watch someone, and again, whatever. Who cares about my opinion? But especially if you're a guy who's writing comic books and like doing it for a living, you obviously know more than me. I would think, but sometimes you see people and you just go, why are you doing this? Well, you've ruined these. You took this thing and you fumbled the bag. Like you had these beautiful characters and you could have ended this 2 trades ago and it would have been just perfect. But you just run these characters into the ground, and it's like, and so it's really. I love when a writer has the ending in mind, or I love when a writer wraps a story up in a way that's meaningful, that you're like, man, I'm glad I invested 10 trades worth of time into this,
Well, speaking of Brian, the one it sometimes it feels random, but it never feels out of place is Saga.
Oh yeah.
The journey he's taking us on in there is unbelievable. Like, and again, sometimes it feels random, but it doesn't feel like it's out of character or out of place.
Yeah, like you'll go, like we'll focus on a different character, it'll focus on a different time. But I feel like even by the end of the trade, he wraps it. Like I've been halfway through a Saga trade and go, what the hell does this have to do with anything else? And by the end, it ties back into the bigger picture. I think that's like a pretty crazy gift in and of itself. Like Hickman does that well. I feel like also as a big picture guy. Mm-hmm. Like I read, what was it, Powers of X, or like the big, when he rebooted X-Men. Yeah. House of X, Powers of 10, whatever it was. So good, but halfway through the trade, I was like, I have no idea what's going on. I have no idea what's going on. Yeah, like I have no idea what the hell he's trying to do. And then three quarters of the way through, you're like, oh, you start seeing the pieces fall together. Like that in and of itself, I think, is a different type of skill to like craft this bigger picture, this giant meta narrative is a pretty incredible thing.
He's unique in my opinion. It's funny that you picked those two, Brian K. Vaughan and Hickman, to talk about, because I see them as 2 completely different writers.
Agreed,
because Vaughan, and actually opposite writers, because Vaughan will give us, he invests us in those characters.
Right.
Like comparing East of West and Saga throws us into a fantasy world or a sci-fi world. We don't know really anything about the outside world. It's huge. We know it's there, and he drops little hints. It's all about the characters.
Yeah.
Hickman, his mind is on so much of the big picture.
Right.
That as East of West.
Yeah.
He just throws us into this world and gives us exposition after exposition, but it pays off.
Mm-hmm. Agreed, yeah, and they're both doing these big picture things. Like you can tell that both of those guys have these universes completely built, and they're just giving you different sort of tools to navigate it, right? Like
Yes.
Hickman shows you the big picture in one way, and Vaughn shows you the bigger picture in another way, and they both have this incredible payoff. But they both have the universe complete, right? Like that's such a big thing to me too. When like both of those guys, you read this big picture thing, Saga or East to West. Even if you don't know what's going on, it still plays by its own rules. Like it still makes sense. Like even for some insane sci-fi, fantasy, Western, crazy, like it can get as crazy and weird as possible, but it still makes sense by its own rules. And I think that's a sign, because sometimes you'll read someone who's trying to build its own world and build their own world, and you'll read it and you read it and it doesn't follow its own rules. And I think to me, nothing pulls you out of that suspension of disbelief more than the guys stepping up with their own
the stuff that he's already laid the ground.
Yeah, right. And you're like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, it doesn't make any sense, obviously, because it's a comic book, but it doesn't make sense in its own, by the rules of its own world, you know. So I love that stuff. I love when a story is new but familiar. I think is the sweet spot, and then also when you can play a juxtaposition between, which I think Vaughn probably does the best, a juxtaposition between like in Saga, between like real human characters, like real characters with real humanity, and then these crazy, wild scenarios and set pieces and circumstances, right?
Yeah.
Like this absurd world that's so different than the reality that we live in every day, but still has these characters that are so rooted. Like you know those people. Like,
yeah,
you know, like the people. Like doesn't matter they have horns and wings and all this shit. Like you know them. Like you know what I'm saying.
And the little ghost girl.
Yeah, yeah. You know those people. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. Something like Saga.
There's tons of stuff for you still to explore as you go through. Now I know you have somewhere to be, so I don't want to keep
worries.
you. But no, thank you for joining us. I wanted to talk to you more about Jeff Lemire because I know you love him as much as I do.
Love him.
And for me, emotional connection, nobody does it better. Within an issue or two, I feel like I'm connected with people.
100%. You know them. I think he actually is probably the best as far as usually it's not. I feel like I guess he does have some weird, some crazy worlds, but I feel like he also is so good. He's the best in my opinion when it's just family dynamic rooted in reality. It's like it seems counterintuitive. You're like, oh, what? Like people will ask me like, you know, I'll be on a fight trip or whatever, and the guys I train with don't give a shit, don't know anything about comic books, right? And they're like, oh, what is it, like a superhero book? And I'm like, no, it's actually about a small family living in a town where the mill closed down, and they're just kind of dealing with some interconnected family generational trauma stuff. The guys are looking like, that sounds terrible. Like what? You're literally escaping reality with a terrible.
Yes, with a horrible reality.
Yeah, you're like, oh, you think like you want to read comic books to like take your mind off. They're thinking like Thor's punching Hulk or something, but it's like, no, I'm reading about a guy whose daughter passed away, and he's dealing with the repercussions of that in his relationship. Like, what the fuck are you reading that for? Like, dude, Lemire, man,
it's good. The connection. It's if you guys haven't read Lemire, please check him out. Ask me for some recommendations because everything he does is wonderful. Well, sir, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it. I look forward to talking to you more about all this stuff. And thank you all for tuning in. And as I said, ask me about Lemire because I can talk about him all day long. Thank you very much for joining us, sir. I will see you again in the shop. And everybody else, have a great one.
Cool. Perfect, brother.
Thank you very much, sir. That was fun. I know you got